This is the story of what happened to Bill Treacher during the 26 years that followed his departure from EastEnders. It is a story about a man who tried more than once to retire, kept being pulled back into acting, and eventually lost that choice when a rare degenerative illness forced him away from the profession for good. To understand those later years, you first have to understand exactly what Bill Treacher walked away from in 1996. Arthur Fowler was not simply another long-running EastEnders character. Bill had been there from the beginning. Before the program had even properly started, creators Julia Smith and Tony Holland already knew they wanted Treacher for Arthur Fowler. The pair had worked with him previously on Z-Cars, and when they created Arthur, they wrote the character with Bill specifically in mind. That made him the first actor ever cast for EastEnders. His first appearance came in the program's opening episode on the 19th of February, 1985. 11 years followed, during which Arthur became one of Walford's most recognizable and frequently troubled residents. He remained fundamentally decent, but trouble seemed to find him constantly. Across those years, Arthur endured 2 prison sentences, suffered a breakdown, spent time in a psychiatric hospital, and nearly destroyed his marriage through an affair. His son was also diagnosed with HIV. The character carried storylines that could be bleak and painful, yet viewers stayed deeply invested in him. That became obvious when Arthur was wrongly imprisoned for embezzlement during one of EastEnders' biggest stories of the mid-1990s. A genuine nationwide Free Arthur Fowler campaign followed, complete with protest t-shirts and even a single that reached the UK singles chart. That was how strongly the public cared about him. For Bill Treacher himself, though, the workload had become unbearable. By 1995, he had already asked producers to write him out, and his reasons had nothing to do with chasing a bigger role elsewhere. Bill later admitted that by the time his run ended, simply hearing the EastEnders theme tune could make him feel ill, and he described himself as depressed. A BBC documentary a few years later gave an even clearer explanation.
Sharon gets everything she wants.
Go on, get out, get out!
So why don't you hit me, eh? You'd really enjoy that, wouldn't you?
Doctors had warned him that the punishing 6-day working week could genuinely kill him. 11 years of one of Britain's busiest television jobs had taken its toll. Arthur Fowler finally left EastEnders in May 1996, released from prison, suffering a brain hemorrhage on his allotment and dying in hospital the following day. The character's ending could not have been more final. Bill Treacher's life away from Albert Square was not. What happened next is slightly surprising, because despite all the talk of stress and retirement, Bill did not disappear from television. Instead, he began working differently, taking occasional roles and keeping his life much quieter. A film role arrived in 1998, with Tale of the Mummy, followed by The Musketeer in 2001. 3 years later, Bill appeared in George and the Dragon, a job that required him to get back on a horse for the first time in 40 years. Television kept finding him too. In 2006, he appeared in ITV's The Bill, and December 2007 brought a guest role in Casualty, playing a security guard caught up in a ram raid and injured in the process. By then, Bill was 77 and insisting that he had retired.
You watched them take me away. You saw it happening and you said nothing!
I didn't think it'd go as far as it did.
The industry apparently had other ideas. Speaking to the East Anglian Daily Times around the time of that Casualty appearance, Bill joked that he kept telling people he was retired, only for the phone to keep ringing. Producers would persuade him to take another job, and he would eventually give in. That little pattern says a lot about his first decade after EastEnders. Bill wanted the freedom of retirement, but he clearly had not lost all interest in acting. Occasional work, without the pressure of Albert Square, suited him far better. His last confirmed screen credit came in 2009, when he was already in his late 70s. There was no grand farewell to the profession. The jobs simply became fewer until they stopped. Away from those scattered appearances, the real center of Bill's life had shifted somewhere much quieter, at home in Suffolk. Bill and his wife, Australian actress Kate Kesey, had been Suffolk residents for years. They married in December 1971 after first working together on stage, where Kate had played his wife in a 1969 touring production of Let Sleeping Wives Lie. Bill was 35 when they met, and Kate was 21. Their family eventually included 2 children. Jamie, born in 1974, followed his father into acting, while Sophie, born in 1978, went into production work. Accounts of the family home describe a converted 19th century former gamekeeper's cottage, a long way from the 6-day soap schedule Bill had once endured in London.
In fact, you better take some of Tebby's advice, Doc, and get on your bike. On your bloody bike, Doc.
For years, that quieter, semi-retired life seemed to suit him. Then, in 2013, everything changed. According to Ataxia UK, Bill was diagnosed that year with ataxia, a degenerative neurological condition affecting coordination, balance, and speech. The illness was little known, and for a while, Bill kept the diagnosis private. 2 years passed before he spoke publicly about what was happening. In February 2015, he gave an interview to the Daily Mirror and confirmed the diagnosis for the first time. By then, retirement was no longer flexible. Bill explained that he now sometimes needed a wheelchair to get around, and acting was no longer something he could return to whenever an interesting offer came along. The irony was hard to miss. For years, Bill had joked that nobody would let him retire. Now illness had made the decision for him. Bill's own words from that period made the change especially clear. Less than a decade earlier, he had laughed about being unable to convince producers that he was retired, yet by 2015, there was no ambiguity left.
What's going on
Mind
here?
your own business.
How dare you? It is my business.
This is between me and Shell, I'm sorry.
The work had stopped because his body would no longer let him continue in the same way. For someone who had spent his life moving between stage, film, and television, that was a very different kind of ending. The diagnosis also changed the way the public saw him. For years, Bill Treacher had been inseparable from Arthur Fowler, a character remembered for worry, pressure, and misfortune. Now, the difficulties were no longer fictional. Balance, coordination, and speech had become real problems in Bill's own life, and there was no script waiting to resolve them by the next episode. That same 2015 interview produced another headline because Bill also admitted he no longer watched EastEnders. He described the program as a load of old rubbish these days, a comment that sounded harsh when taken alone. His wider explanation showed something more complicated. Bill remained proud of the program he had helped build, but he believed the quality had changed. He remembered his own era as a time when the storylines were stronger, and the BBC had put its best writers behind the show. At the same time, he spoke warmly about his own years there. The work had been relentless, but Bill remembered it as exciting, and he said that excitement gave the cast the energy to keep going. That contradiction followed him into his final decade. EastEnders had exhausted him badly enough that doctors warned him to leave, yet he still felt protective of the version he remembered. His relationship with EastEnders also never became a simple story of rejection. Bill had left because the job was damaging his health, and years later, he could be openly critical of what the program had become. Yet he still spoke warmly about the excitement of those early years. That mixture of pride, exhaustion, and disappointment makes his later comments easier to understand. He had not forgotten what the show gave him, but he had also never forgotten what it cost. Once the ataxia diagnosis became public, Bill could easily have withdrawn completely. Instead, he used the attention around his name to talk about the condition. Ataxia UK later explained that he deliberately mentioned his diagnosis during press interviews because he wanted to raise awareness. Most people knew little or nothing about the illness, even though it had quietly taken away his mobility and ended his acting career. The charity also described Bill as an enthusiastic reader of Ataxia magazine. He was especially moved by stories from people diagnosed much younger than he had been, people who had faced the condition for far longer. That became one of the clearest features of his later years. When journalists asked about his health, Bill answered, he did not turn himself into a celebrity campaigner or build a second public career around the illness. He simply spoke about it whenever the opportunity came, hoping that naming the condition might help somebody else understand it. For the rest of his life, those occasional interviews became the main way the public heard from Bill Treacher. On the 5th of November 2022, 9 years after his diagnosis, Bill died in hospital in Ipswich, Suffolk. He was 92 years old. His family announced the death shortly afterwards, explaining that his health had been declining for some time and asking for privacy. Their statement remembered him as a deeply loved husband and father, as well as a brilliant actor and a fine human being. Kate had lost the man she married more than 50 years earlier. Jamie and Sophie had lost their father. The reported cause of death was pneumonia, with complications from COVID-19. Ataxia UK made a point of noting that he died from what they called an unrelated condition, meaning the ataxia itself was not what ultimately killed him. After 9 years of living with a disease that had already cost him his mobility and career, something else ended his life. The family statement after his death reflected how private Bill's final years had become. It named Kate, Jamie, and Sophie and stressed how much he had meant to them, rather than turning the announcement into a celebration of television fame. After more than 50 years of marriage, Kate had been beside him through the years before EastEnders, the height of Arthur Fowler's popularity, and the long period after the program ended. That same contrast ran through the tributes from his colleagues. Viewers had spent 11 years watching Arthur carry one crisis after another, but the people standing beside Bill between takes remembered someone cheerful and mischievous. The man associated with some of EastEnders' bleakest early storylines apparently spent a great deal of his working day trying to make everybody else laugh. The tributes that followed revealed another side of Bill, one viewers rarely saw through Arthur Fowler. EastEnders remembered him as one of the program's original cast members and credited him, alongside Wendy Richard, with creating the Fowler family that became central to the show. Their statement also remembered his charm, humor, and smile. Chris Clenshaw, the show's executive producer at the time, spoke about growing up watching Arthur on his allotment and described him as one of Walford's true originals. Former colleagues became even more personal. Letitia Dean, who had worked with Bill since the early years of EastEnders, remembered him as the life and soul of the set. She also praised how seriously he approached Arthur, putting enormous care into everything from small scenes to the character's hardest storylines. Gillian Tailforth remembered the same playful side. Her memories centered on the look in Bill's eyes just before he made other actors laugh during a scene. Adam Woodyat told a similar story. Bill would get a particular twinkle in his eye, set everyone else off, and somehow avoid taking the blame when the cast broke character. Adam ended his tribute with a line longtime viewers immediately understood, saying he hoped there were some roses waiting for Bill to tend. It was a direct nod to Arthur Fowler's allotment, the same place where the character suffered the brain hemorrhage that led to his death 26 years earlier. Even actors who had worked with Bill for much shorter periods remembered him in the same way. Michael Tudor Barnes, who played conman Willie Roper, later described Bill as welcoming, helpful, professional, and unfailingly cheerful, even when the work became difficult. The praise was remarkably consistent. People remembered the actor, not just the character. Arthur Fowler, meanwhile, never completely disappeared from EastEnders. He belonged to the original group of 23 characters created for the program in 1985, and his stories remained part of EastEnders history long after Bill left. Arthur's 1986 breakdown, in particular, continued to be remembered as one of British television's early attempts to explore mental illness seriously through a mainstream soap. When EastEnders marked its 40th anniversary in 2025, archive footage of Arthur appeared during the celebrations. That meant the character Bill created was still appearing on British television nearly 30 years after his departure, and around 3 years after his death. Looking back at the 26 years between Arthur Fowler's death and Bill Treacher's own, his later life divides almost naturally into two very different periods. For more than a decade after EastEnders, Bill kept acting whenever a role tempted him enough. He appeared in films, returned to television, climbed onto a horse after 40 years, and joked that nobody in the industry seemed willing to accept that he had retired. The work became lighter, and life became quieter. Suffolk gave him the distance he wanted from EastEnders, while occasional acting allowed him to keep one foot in the profession without returning to the schedule that had made him ill. That choice disappeared in 2013. Ataxia gradually restricted his movement and eventually brought his acting career to a permanent close. A man who once had to be persuaded to stop accepting jobs no longer had the option. Bill responded in a very understated way. He gave interviews, spoke candidly about his illness, criticized EastEnders when he felt criticism was deserved, and defended the version of the program he had loved. Most importantly, he talked about ataxia because most people had never heard of it. There was no dramatic second career, and there did not need to be one. When Bill died in November 2022 at 92, the most revealing tributes were not really about Arthur Fowler's prison sentences, breakdown, or the famous Free Arthur campaign. They were about laughter. Colleagues remembered a man who broke them up during scenes, someone with a mischievous look in his eye, and an actor who treated the work seriously without taking himself too seriously. Letitia Dean remembered the life and soul of the set. Adam Woodyard remembered the man who could make everybody corpse and somehow escape the blame. Those memories tell you more about Bill Treacher's final legacy than any dramatic storyline ever could. Arthur Fowler remained one of EastEnders' most recognizable originals, but Bill Treacher spent another 26 years building a quieter life beyond Albert Square. He worked when he wanted to, retired when he could, lost that freedom when illness arrived, and used the years that remained to bring attention to a condition most people had never heard of. EastEnders gave Bill his most famous role, but his later years showed the man behind it. Arthur Fowler died on screen in 1996. Bill Treacher lived for another 26 years, through occasional acting, family life in Suffolk, forced retirement, and a degenerative illness that changed the shape of his final decade. When he died in November 2022, age 92, EastEnders lost the first actor it had ever cast. The program remembered Arthur Fowler. The people who knew Bill remembered the laughter